Hello, I'm Kent, and today we're going to talk about the importance of making perfect tenons on your wood bowls. Okay, you might be thinking, why do we have to make the tenon perfect? Does it really have to be perfect? Every bowl isn't perfect. No, you don't have to make every bowl perfect, but if there's any part of the bowl you want to get as close to perfect, it's the tenon. What happens at the base of the bowl when the tenon's attached properly is you have a good secure connection to your four-jaw chuck. All right, with that good secure connection, you're not going to have any vibration, which might give you tool marks and might just cause frustrations for you. At best case scenario, worst case scenario, it could come completely out of the chuck and go flying across the room, and we definitely don't want that. So we're going to take the time and make the tenon as perfect as possible to prevent all sorts of problems and issues down the road. In order to make the tenon perfect, we basically have to match it to this four-jaw chuck. And this chuck has several different characteristics. It has a top rim, which the shoulder of our tenon will rest firmly against, and inside it has angled dovetail jaws. You can see on the side here there are these, both the outside and the inside of the jaws are angled. This gives us the extra gripping capability and the prevention of that tenon from slipping out when we're turning our bowl. So we really want to accommodate that angle when we make our tenon and match it so it grips properly. The other aspect and something to keep in mind is the base of the four-jaw chuck is not part of the tenon construction. In other words, we don't want the tenon to be so long that it touches the base of the four-jaw chuck. That will cause a problem. The shoulders will sit on the top of the four-jaw chuck, and the dovetails will grip it from the sides. That's the only two contact points our tenon needs to make in order for it to be perfect. All right, so the next thing we need to be concerned with is the size of the tenon that we're going to make. The four jaws should make a complete circle. Right now, and I'm going to exaggerate this a little bit so we can see it, if we were to use the jaws in this configuration and insert a tenon that's this big in here, the only areas that are going to contact the tenon are the corners of each of the jaws. And that's really only going to give us little 8 points of contact. And those corners are going to dig into the tenon, and that's not going to give us our best connection. When we close the jaws, we're going to see they will come together. However, if you look closely, this is not a perfect circle. Each one of these curves is smaller or a little bit bigger than the area around them. And there's a reason for that. When the four jaws are made for each of these chucks, they are machined from one piece of metal, and that metal is turned in a metal lathe, ironically, to make a perfect circle here. And this is a disc with the dovetails on it. It's a solid piece when it's milled, and they take and cut this whole element gets cut apart here and here, and then you have the four individual jaws. Well, where it's cut, that material is removed. So if you look at the jaws when they're open slightly, you're going to see that now those jaws make a complete circle and a nice smooth circle. So if we make our tenon to match this inside, at this point we're going to have full contact inside the jaws. Each jaw is going to grip that tenon properly instead of the individual points when it's too large. And we have a little bit of extra room too if we need to. We can tighten it just a bit to really grip into it nicely. Whereas if we make a tenon that's sized all the way down to this being closed, if we mess up just a hair and make it just a little too small, all of a sudden that tenon is just going to spin inside there and it defeats the whole purpose. We have no grip at that point. So what we want to do is you want to look at the point on your jaws where the jaws are all round, and it should look something like this, where they're opened up and there's spaces between them. Okay, so now I'm going to use my dividers to measure this, and the tops of the jaws are narrower than the base of it. So I really want to measure for the base of it. So if you see here, I'm sitting on top of these jaws just a little bit wider than the top of it. And that's going to be the measurement. Now, if you don't want to use dividers, you can use a measuring tape, and you can measure that distance and record it and know what that is. If you want to use the measuring tape, I suggest doing the same thing that we just did with the dividers, which is you come in a little bit on each of the jaws, measure in there. So I'm looking at about almost 1 3/4 inches, maybe a 1/16 below that. Okay, so I've prepared a bowl blank, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark the center here. I'm going to turn the lathe on, and I'm just going to look right here where there's the center point. I'm going to put a little mark right there. So the first way you can measure and mark your tenon is just simply measure it with the tape measure like we just did, which is you're going to take that distance just over an inch, just under 1 3/4 inches, and then divide that in half. Or you could take the 1 3/4 inches and position that centered over the dot. Okay, personally, I don't like that way because it takes a little bit too much time. What I do is I like to transfer the points of the divider to the blank itself and scribe the line. Now you have to be really careful when you do this. You're only touching the left divider point to the bowl blank, not the right divider point. You get the lathe going. You don't have to have it going really high. I'm approximating the center point. You can see that I'm positioning each arm close to the same distance from the center. Now I'm angling it a bit so just the left tip is going to touch, but I'm looking at the right tip and seeing if it is over the line. The right tip's not touching. This tip doesn't touch, but I can see that it's positioned over the top, and now I've just transferred the width on there. Let's turn it off and take a look. Do not do that with the lathe running, because if that right side grabs, it's going to flip it over and you're going to have problems. But essentially here you can see that the width of the 4-jaw chuck, which we marked earlier, is simply transferred directly to the bowl blank. Okay, so now with that already marked, now what I need to do is I need to remove material here all the way across up to that line. This is going to be the bottom of the tenon, and now I'm going to remove the thickness of the tenon. The 4-jaw chuck is approximately, let's take a look here. It's about almost a 1/2 inch deep. I'm not going to make the tenon a 1/2 inch deep because, as we mentioned in the beginning, we do not want the tenon touching the bottom of the 4-jaw chuck. Okay, so the way I take this material off is with simple push cuts. Using the bowl gouge, I'm going to make push cuts in up to that line and stop. Okay, that's the approximate shape of our tenon. Now we need to make a shoulder. The shoulder needs to be completely flush this way. So what I can do is I can actually use the bowl gouge and run it across here and make sure this is flush. And actually when I'm doing this, I can see that that inside's slightly concave. So I'm going to go back across, true this up, and then I'm going to remove more material on the side to make a shoulder. Now those are push cuts going basically across the face of the bull. What I want to do is make sure that I've got, go ahead and turn this off for a second. What I want to make sure is I've got good clean in-grain cuts, and you can see right here that I don't. These are ripped off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the tool rest a little bit, and I'm going to do push cuts going in here so that that pushing direction is trimming off that in-grain and cleaning it up. Okay, so we have our tenon shape, rough shape. We don't have the dovetail yet, and we have the shoulder. So far, so good. Now we have to create the angle for this shoulder. So right here you can see that the shape, and I'm going to use a divider so you can see this, the shape of this particular tenon is kind of curved right there. So that's not going to sit down into the jaws really snug. It's going to sit right up on the jaws. So we need to make a dovetail inward cut, and we need to make sure that that inside corner is nice and crisp so that this seats well inside the four-jaw chuck. Now the way I like to do this is by using a detail spindle gouge. A detail spindle gouge is going to allow me to get in there and make this cut really delicate and simple. It does take a little bit of practice, but because we're using a spindle gouge with a sharp edge, I'm cutting those in-grain fibers. There are tools available, such as a tenon scraper, and I'll put a link down in the descriptions for that. But a tenon scraper at this point essentially is much like a, let me grab one here, is much like a skew, in that you can do this with a skew too, but you basically just enter at a slight angle so that you scrape away that dovetail. Now, the only problem with that is that when you come across that in-grain, scraping tends to rip that out, and I don't like that effect, and it's going to give us a potential rough edge there that will be a problem with our chuck. So instead what I do is, again, I use the spindle detail gouge. Now, word of warning here, never use a spindle gouge for anything of massive material removal when turning a side grain bull blank. Side grain, the orientation is going across the perpendicular with the drive or the headstock. So, and it's what happens is these aren't made sturdy enough to handle the force of that. So you always want to use a bull gouge. Now what I'm doing here is very minor detail work, and it's not under much stress or force, so we'll be okay here. Now the biggest trick with the detail spindle gouge is get it up on a 90-degree angle, introduce it at the corner there, and just wait a second. Let it start its own little groove, and then proceed forward with a push cut. Now I'm eyeballing an inside angle here. When I get to the base of this, I'm going to rotate this a little bit inward and slide it out. Just like that. Now I want to make sure I've got a good crisp corner there, and I've got the angle I need. And now if I want to, I can come back in here, and it doesn't hurt to actually go down in just a little bit. When you go in a little bit, it's going to make that inside corner very crisp, and the jaws are going to lock in there very well. One other thing I like to do that's really helpful here is, in this particular orientation, because I'm using the faceplate, I don't have my tailstock up, and I have the tailstock put away right now, so it's kind of a pain to bring the tailstock out. But it's going to be really helpful to have a little mark right here so that I can line this up when I'm done to take and center it quickly for taking the tenon off. So what I do is I just basically come in here with the spindle detail gouge, just make a little dinky touch right there. And that's it. That's all you need. Okay, so let's turn that off. Now if you want to test your tenon shape, you can just stop the lathe and bring your chuck up to the bull blank. Okay, so go ahead and open the jaws of your chuck, place it over the tenon. This is just for checking it, especially when you're first learning how to do this. What you're looking for are two important things. First of all, you want to make sure that this shoulder that you've created is sitting perfectly flush and in contact with the top of the jaws. There should be zero space there. When I say zero space, I mean not even a hair. If there's a hair gap in there, you need to go back and crisp up that corner so that that seats in there much better. Now the other thing we're looking for is we don't want that tenon to touch the bottom of the chuck, which it's not there. You can see the space in between there. There's plenty of space. Matter of fact, I'm going to take one of these jaws off so you can see this a little bit better. Here we can see exactly what's happening. We have the shoulder, which is nice and flush, and it's resting squarely on top of the jaws. The angle, you can see the dovetail angle, and this has just been eyeballed. I know that might seem like it's very complicated, but after you've done 3 or 4 of these, you can easily eyeball that angle and create it yourself. And then the other big factor is this tenon does not touch anywhere inside the bottom of the 4-jaw chuck. The only 2 contact points are the top of the shoulder and the inside of the dovetail itself. That right there is a perfect tenon that's going to give you stability and control while you go and turn the rest of this bull. People ask me sometimes why I make the shoulder so deep, and actually this is a pretty shallow shoulder. Sometimes I'll make them much deeper than that. Well, the reason I do that is so I have extra material when I come to removing the tenon. I can shape the foot and create a new design of the foot and do a whole bunch of different things if I have extra material there in the form of the shoulder and the tenon. If I don't, I could get stuck. I could have sometimes I've actually had that shoulder has helped me where I've gone a little too deep in the interior of the bull and I've got extra meat in the shoulder that I can make up for it and compensate. I've found that having a shoulder there has helped tremendously. So the biggest thing to take away from this is the more time you spend making your tenon as perfect as possible, the better turning experience you're going to have. If you rush this process and you have just a little bit of material in there that's causing that tenon not to seat properly in here, you can have all kinds of issues. I've seen people that have been frustrated to no end because they're getting tool marks and they're having all kinds of issues with the bull. Their technique with the bull gouge and everything is fine. However, because that bull blank is not seated properly and just shifts a hair, it will never be smooth, and that can be incredibly frustrating. So all it takes is just to spend a little bit extra time and make sure that you've shaped your tenon with a nice dovetail angle that matches your chuck. You don't have it too long, and you've taken the time to make that shoulder nice and flush so it sits perfectly smooth and sharp on the top of the 4-jaw chuck. Once you've done all that, you're going to have great experiences turning bulls. So I hope you liked this video. If you did, please hit the like button. If you aren't already a subscriber, please click subscribe and click that bell, and you'll be notified when my new videos come up, and I've got more on the way. And as always, happy turning.